I'm so glad that you've tuned in to one of the sermons from St Mary's. If you're new to our church and would like to find out more about being involved, please visit our website and drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you.
So I'm just going to invite Caroline up, who I've never met, but I have emailed. Hello, Caroline. Lovely to have you with us. And Caroline's going to be bringing our Bible reading today, which is Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47, and from the NIV, if you would like to follow along.
So the Bible reading, once again, is from Acts chapter 2, verse 42 to 47. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Caroline, thanks very much for reading for us this morning. Welcome if you're in the building. I'm wondering about renaming the building the Ice Cube this morning. It really is quite cold in here. I thought it'd be a great name for a nightclub as well. If you're at home, you really are better off. Thank you, Tom, for helping us to get exercised a little bit to be able to think about our bodies. We're thinking about the body of the church this morning, so that's completely appropriate. And this morning is a little bit like Richard Osman's House of Games. If ever you've seen that, we've moved from a would you rather to a quiz question. Let me start this morning's sermon by asking you a question. What have these five all got in common? What have these five all got in common? Timperley Early, McDonald's Canadian Red, Holstein Blood Red, German wine, Riverside Giant. What have they all got in common? Alcohol, that's a very interesting suggestion. They might be alcoholic. Anne Thomas, oh my word, somebody's gone right for it. I just kind of shouted out, Anne Thomas, what was your answer going to be? Yes, well done to the two people who cried out, rhubarb. Sounds like a pantomime. But yes, they have in common the fact that they are all varieties of rhubarb. And I'm feeling particularly excited by rhubarb today. Not every Sunday that you start a sermon in that way, or indeed think that every week, but this Sunday marks the first Sunday of my rhubarb harvest at home. I'm growing a particular variety called Timperley Early, and the clue's all in the name. The harvest comes very early in the season. There is the plant. It's kind of done the same thing that it always does. It's sprung up in a kind of rhubarbish type of way. And it's looking very much the same as normal, the same plant in the same position doing the same things. Except that obviously kind of its burst to life in 2021, we really hope and pray in a year that's a very different context to 2020. When it was springing up last year, we'd just gone into the initial stages of the first lockdown. Hopefully, we're now emerging from that particular season. So in a sense, it's the same plant, but it's a very different context. And in many ways, I've never really done this. I've never related rhubarb to the Bible before, but in many ways, that rhubarb plant encapsulates something of the book of Acts. Acts is all about a harvest. It's all about a harvest in a context which in many ways is the same to what's been going before it. But in certain ways, there are also big differences to just a few months previously. And so that's where we're going in Acts 2, a harvest with both similarities and differences to just a few weeks, even months ago. As we do that, why don't we pray together? Lord Jesus, we thank you for the fact that you are the living word. We thank you that you're the living word because you have risen again and you've sent your Spirit onto your church and he's at work through your words. So thank you that you are the living word in person who's with us now. Would you please bring your word alive, not just in our hearts, but also in our actions as we go and live for your praise and glory. Amen. So firstly, what we've got in Acts 2 as we begin this new series in the book of Acts is the story of a harvest. I'm not sure about you, but it seems a bit early to be thinking about harvest in a UK context. Normally when we think about harvest, we do that, don't we, in kind of September, October type of time. But actually, if we were living in the nation of Israel, and particularly Israel during Bible times, this is the season of harvest. It all begins with the festival of Easter, Jewish Passover, and that marked really the beginning of the barley harvest. And then 7 weeks later, around about the Feast of Pentecost, Jewish feast of or festival of Shavuot, then there's the wheat harvest. This is the season of harvest. A time of kind of gathering in everything that's been planted, a time of reaping all those things that have been sown in days gone by. And Acts 2, this passage that we were looking at this morning, brings all of that into really sharp focus. Peter's just preached his first ever sermon, the first sermon in a sense of the modern church. And he's finished his sermon with these words. It's just before the passage that we read in Acts 2. With many other words, he pleaded with the crowd, saying, "Save yourselves from this corrupt generation." Those who accepted his message were baptized, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day. So here we've got a growing plant. We've got a growing fellowship of believers. 3,000 were added to their number that day. A harvest of souls being gathered in. If you remember, Jesus said to Peter when he first met him, he said, "I will make you a fisher of men." Not a physical harvest from the sea, but a spiritual harvest from the land. And that's exactly what we've got going on here. Peter's seeing that promise come true. 3,000 people were added to that number that day. The seed that was planted in some of them long ago has now come to fruition and has burst forth, not just into blossom, but into fruit that is now being reaped. There's a moment of joyful reaping. But there's also a moment of challenge when it comes to harvest. Harvest, you might be aware of the fact, isn't all joy. Reaping often is associated with dark or negative images in the UK, but actually reaping is a real moment of joy. Reaping and bringing all that harvest in. But what follows the reaping is threshing and winnowing. If you're agricultural in any way, you might be aware of that. And so there's a moment after that grain has been reaped where it's brought in and it's really beaten up pretty hard. It's threshed, it's hit. And that's to disconnect the stalks and the husks from the grain. And then there's a process of winnowing. So a big winnowing fork is kind of put under all of that grain. It's thrown into the air, normally in a really exposed and windy place, quite often a hilltop, and the wind blows away the chaff, the husks and the stalks, and then the grain falls back down to earth. All of that happens today, carefully shielded behind very neat metal-looking shutters of combined harvesters that do the collecting in, the reaping. We see that going in the front, but then we see an enormous cloud of chaff coming out of the back as the very pure grain then pours out the side, having been separated. And that physical journey of harvest is similar to the spiritual journey that the church goes on in Acts. They're finding that following Jesus is both joyful, but equally can sometimes be really hard going. Sometimes it can feel a little bit like being spiritually beaten up, as kind of stuff stripped off, and we're refined and we're purified to leave behind a good harvest. In many ways, the last 12 months in the UK might have felt like a moment of harvest. In some senses, it's been a joy-filled spiritual harvest against a backdrop of dark storm clouds. Many people have expressed a sense of wanting to grow spiritually more towards the light of Jesus. We've seen in our community a sense of wanting to explore faith. Some people to deepen faith that's currently there, some people to explore faith for the first time. There's been a sense that people have been articulating of wanting to experience faith directly, not so much just to explore it, but to actually get an experience of it. We've found lots of people passing through our church day by day wanting to pray, wanting to pick up the literature that we've been leaving at the Lichgate and just inside the church. There's a sense here of seeds, sometimes planted long ago, but wanting to grow and to blossom and to flourish, a spiritual harvest. In our own setting, we've connected with people coming to church, wanting to pray. We've had people emailing the church office and the clergy team wanting to chat and to pray together. We've mentioned the literature that we've been giving away at the Lichgate. I can remember a lady coming up to me at the end of one of our carol services just last Christmas, saying a really profound thank you. I'd never met her before, but saying a real profound thank you for a book that she'd picked up from the Lichgate that she'd read and had been really special for her. I can remember a lady coming out of one of our carol services, having had a more or less kind of direct experience in some way that she couldn't really put into words of God. And as she left through the door, it was clear that she wanted to say something, but she didn't have words to express what she'd experienced of God here. So we've seen a sense of joy in this season of harvest. But I'm sure that we would resonate that actually in the last 12 months, we've also seen something of a challenge. Lockdown has perhaps made us more aware than ever, not just of our physical weaknesses, but also of our spiritual inner weaknesses. It's brought things that perhaps we've kept buried deep within ourselves much more to the surface. Weaknesses perhaps in our deep character or attitudes. Weaknesses in the way that our minds work or perhaps don't work as we might like them to. Actions, perhaps patterns of behavior that we've either been surprised by or have kind of resurged back to the surface, things that resemble the chaff and the husks that we really want blown away, even if we recognize that that whole process isn't without pain. And so I wonder how this season of harvest lands with you this morning. Who are the people that God might be calling you to extend a fishing rod of connection towards in your local community or neighborhoods? Where might God be calling you to grow even more towards his light? Might there be areas of chaff that you would like to bring to him and just say, Lord, would you blow this away and would you refine me? Acts 2 is a season of harvest. I'm still partially thinking about my lunch. So let me take you back to rhubarb and to Timperley Early, and to that plant that we started off our sermon with, the same plant, even if there's also a sense in which it's a new plant for a new season, the same context that it was placed in, but equally a new context as well. And that's really the sense that we've got with this Acts church. Here is Peter, who just a few weeks earlier, before Jesus' death and resurrection, had really been in some fear. Where is Jesus heading? And then certainly after Jesus' death, he and the disciples had gone into full-on lockdown. They'd been hiding in Jerusalem. But here is that same Peter who once had been fearful of his city, fearful of his life. Here is that same Peter giving the first sermon of the church boldly in the public square. The same people, but a different church. The same context, but a different atmosphere. The same Jesus who had been put to death on a Roman cross, but a totally different body. Jesus is still there. Jesus is alive. He's risen and he's ascended, but he's got a resurrection body. This is the same Jesus, but the risen Jesus, and he's ascended into heaven, and now he's at work through his Spirit in the acts of his church. The church is the body of Jesus on earth. I've spoken to lots of different church leaders and lots of different church members around the UK and across the world in the last 12 months. And most have been reflecting how lockdown has actually taken the church outside the walls of the building. Perhaps over the years leading up to lockdown, I found it difficult to engage with our neighbours. Perhaps we lacked a bit of impetus when it came to serving our community beyond the walls. Perhaps we were slightly more comfortable putting on a large event in a church on a Sunday than we were for having a kind of a micro conversation with a friend or a neighbour at the bus stop during the week. Perhaps we were even a bit fearful of being Christians in the cityscape around us. Then lockdown hit and churches across the nation had to shut our doors, but actually we found in slightly strange ways we were almost more opened up than perhaps we'd been before. We made new friends during that weekly clap for carers. We eyeballed our neighbours perhaps for the first time. We leapt into action, whether it was sending them a card or we learnt new things like what Zoom was, or how to WhatsApp friends. We learnt that it was really easy to sign up to volunteer at the food bank or to help out at a local vaccination centre or to take part in a local mental health awareness group. Church members began to be seen taking coffees, walking with each other around the Downs and having conversations to check in with each other. Zoom meant that it was even easier than ever before to invite friends to services because all you had to do was to ping them a Zoom link and say, do come along if you'd like to. We even found that church morphed from the building to communities even praying on their street corners as people gathered their neighbours together and said, did you want to pray on a Sunday morning because we can't go to church? We're the same church, but we're a different church. Our context is the same, but the atmosphere has changed. Church has gone out beyond the walls. And the exciting thing is that the UK has noticed. I can't remember any previous Prime Minister giving an Easter message to the church To be perfectly honest, I don't know him, but to be perfectly honest, I can't imagine Boris having given an Easter message in 2020. On the Number 10 website last week, this is what Boris said. If there's one thing that British Christians have shown this year, it is that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, not just today, but every day. His teaching and resurrection and death permeate every aspect of daily life. That's why, as Prime Minister, I've lost count of the number of church leaders and congregations who have stepped up to support us all in these very challenging times. Millions of good Samaritans showing what loving your neighbour as yourself looks like in 21st century Britain. A season of harvest, a season which has encouraged us to do things differently, and a season where that's been noticed. But equally, it's a season where not everything has been different. There are some things that are the same, and that's where we come in to land. And actually, that was our passage in Acts 2. Having basically, up until now, we've just been doing context for Acts. Actually, our passage in Acts 2 was all about what stays the same. The plant, in many ways, is still the same. Jesus' body is changed, but in many ways, it's still acting in the same way. And so that's what this sermon series over the next few weeks up until Pentecost is going to be about. It's answering the question, what did the early church devote itself to? That's why we've called it Devoted. What did the early church devote itself to? What's not changed? What is not new in the normal? What's not changed? Here's what Acts said. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, which is exactly why I'm stood here this morning, 2,000 years later. They devoted themselves to fellowship, which is why we've never stopped meeting up at any point in the last 12 months, whether that's in person, whether it's at home, on Zoom, or on YouTube. They devoted themselves to the breaking of bread, which is exactly why we're doing communion this morning, and to prayer, which is why week by week, day by day, you can join us at 9 o'clock every morning for prayer, and there's lots of other prayer opportunities during the week as well. Everyone was filled with wonder at the many signs and wonders performed by the apostles. And miracles today, in 2021, still point to the risen and ascended Jesus. If you haven't heard the miracle of the water from the Northwest Bristol Food Bank in Avonmouth just last year, then let me know at the end of the service and I will tell you the miracle of the water. All the believers had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. If you were to speak to Caroline Owen, our treasurer, she would share with you the really encouraging news that in the last 12 months over lockdown, we've seen our generous giving go up rather than go down. This is a season of harvest. It's been joyful, it's been challenging, and it's certainly not over yet. Even though we're the same people in the same context, some things have changed, and there will be changes that we'll want to hold on to. They've been good news in an otherwise bad news world, and they've been noticed. But some things don't change. We'll still teach, we'll still gather together, we'll still share communion with each other, we'll still pray, we'll still give generously, and the Spirit will still point us to Jesus in many things, day by day, and in some amazing signs and wonders as well. And in all of this, we'll continue to pray that we'll see in the same way as Acts 2 that the Lord will add daily the number being saved.